Lesson 4. The Bone Wars. Perhaps just as interesting as fossils you might see at a museum is the story behind their discovery. Our next explorers were two friends whose close friendship came to a bitter end. Edward Drinker Cope was born in 1840 in Philadelphia. He had always been interested in animals on their farm and convinced his father that he should go to the University of Philadelphia to study comparative anatomy. Remember, that is where you compare two species to study their similarities and differences. Cope's father hoped to pass the family farm to his son and agreed. He believed an education might help him treat the farm animals. Cope's interest, however, led him astray from cows and horses and eventually carried him into the bright, shiny, new, and exciting field of paleontology. In 1863, when he was 23 years old, Cope's father sent him to Germany to study natural history and to avoid fighting in the U.S. Civil War. There he met a friend who shared similar interests in his own. Othniel Marsh, who specialized in chemistry, mineralogy, paleontology, and geology. Marsh was about 9 years older than Cope and a graduate of the school where Cope was studying. The two men had much in common, from their farming fathers to the fields of study, and they had long conversations walking the grounds. The next year, when Cope returned to the United States, the two men wrote letters, exchanged pictures, and even namely classified species after one another. For many years, the two men held one another in high esteem and were in close contact, but like many relationships, one fateful decision changed everything. The Bone Wars. With so many new things being discovered all the time, a scientist, much like a sleuth, had to follow the discoveries to make observations of their own and stay on the cutting edge of their field. Because of this, Marsh made the long journey to America to study the new fossils being discovered there. While he was there, Cope took him on a tour of a new dig site he was working at in New Jersey. Unbeknownst to Cope, Marsh made an underhanded move. He talked to the workers and told them to tell him, instead of Cope, if they found any fossils. Like most secrets, this betrayal eventually came to light, and Cope found out. As you might imagine, he was furious. To make matters worse, Cope published a new species and had reconstructed it incorrectly. Marsh was the first to publicly point out his mistake. It was a humiliating blow for the young friend, who tried to purchase all the journals where his paper had been published to control the damage as much as possible. Regardless of their history together, these acts marked the end of their friendship and the beginning of a bitter 25-year competition known as the Bone Wars. As has been the case of many professional battles, money proved to be a deciding factor. The more money each man could assess, the more people they could hire, the faster they could dig, and the more discoveries they could name. Both men applied for government funding to support their expeditions. Their heated rivalry also pushed them to pour in their personal inheritance and funds to propel them just a little bit further. Marsh even hired spies to work with Cope and inform on all his discoveries and secrets. When they each happened upon a similar fossil, they rushed to name it as soon as possible, often claiming the same discovery at the same time, under different names, of course. Things continued to decline when Marsh sought to gain power over Cope. In 1882, Marsh became the chief paleontologist of the U.S. Geological Survey and cut off Cope's government funding. He claimed that Cope's fossil collection should be owned by the U.S. government because he had used government funds. However, when Cope proved how much of his own money he had used, Marsh's plan failed. The two men took their competition public, attacking one another in the media. Here Cope gained the upper hand. He had been carefully recording Marsh's devious tactics and waiting for his moment to expose him. The world watched their bitter battle like a train wreck before their very eyes, and eventually, the U.S. Geological Survey was dissolved. In a stroke of irony, Marsh's ended up losing some of the collection over the same issue of which he had accused Cope, keeping fossils that were government-funded. During the course of 25 years, fossils were destroyed, bribes were made, discoveries were stolen. Far from a professional competition, the Bone Wars became deeply personal for these two friends, who became consumed with destroying one another. Brontosaurus, that's the name of the next chapter. Both Cope and Marsh made massive headway in the field of paleontology, funding many new species. Yet in their haste to name them and claim their discoveries, mistakes were made. Let's take a look at one of the most widely known discoveries made during this time, the Brontosaurus. In 1877, Marsh discovered a new type of sauropod, which he named Apatosaurus. At the time, he had pieces of the new creature, but rushed to name it before he had all the information in order to stay ahead of his competition. A few years later, he found another sauropod, which he quickly named the Brontosaurus. For years after that, he was able to complete a full skeleton of the Brontosaurus, but he had made a fairly large error. He gave it to the skull of another sauropod entirely, the Camosaurus. It would take scientists many years to fix the errors made by Marsh in an attempt to build a legacy. The scientific community has rules for naming new species. One of these rules is that the first name is the correct name. This means that Brontosaurus is actually not the accurate name for this famous dino, but rather the Apatosaurus. The Stegosaurus. In the same areas of Morrison, Colorado, where the Apatosaurus was found, a man named Arthur Lakes found some huge dinosaur bones and hoped to get funding to explore the area further. He reached out to Marsh, who wasn't interested. Then he contacted Cope. When Marsh heard that Lakes was seeking the help of his rival, Marsh changed his mind and hired Lakes for himself, purely out of jealousy. It was here that the first Stegosaurus was found and named, once again by Marsh. This unique dinosaur was originally thought to have bony plates that laid flat on his back, like flat armor, when we now know that they stood up straight instead. When the plates were embedded in the skin, they were flexible, not fixed to the spine like bone. The Stegosaurus had spikes on its tail, known today as stegomizers, and a beak slowly and eat small shrubs and grass. I'm sorry, I made a mistake there. Stegomizers and a beak-like mouth. Because their front legs were shorter than their back legs, the Stegosaurus would have had to move slowly and eat small shrubs and grasses. With such a small head, scientists hypothesized that the dinosaur had an extremely below-average sized brain, or possibly a brain that was shaped to be longer and thinner in order to fit its narrow skull. The Stegosaurus' long, flexible tail was thought to be used for defense. This theory was supported by the fact that some of the tail spikes were found to be broken at the tips, and similar puncture wounds were found in the fossils of one of the Stegosaurus predators, the Allosaurus. The bone plates along its back have been debated and wondered about for over a century. Some thought they were used to help regulate temperature, a theory supported by the blood vessels found within them. However, many believed that they were used as a way to attract a mate. Since this early discovery, a great number of other fossils have been found of the Stegosaurus, and it is one of the most widely recognized dinosaurs to this day. A coin with two sides. There is no doubt that Edward Cope and Othniel Marsh were brilliant scientists who made some incredible discoveries that drastically impacted the field of paleontology. However, they also made some catastrophic errors in their obsession of beating one another. The bone wars seemed to progress with 2 steps forward and 1 step back, bringing with it the advantage of a large number of discoveries along with the disadvantage of mistakes and even false information. Though these 2 men may have thought they were deeply committed to the field, they were fueled by conflict and even what might be perceived as a selfish aim to grow their own names and legacies over their dedication to excellence. Both men died within a few years of each other with only a small sum of money in their accounts, their entire life savings devoted to inching ahead of the other. Theirs is a story of remarkable victories and sad consequences, and a sober warning to us all. That concludes Lesson 4, The Bone Wars, for today.